In a barn that hadn't been opened in 40 years, they found the children. 17 of them. Their ages ranged from 4 to 19. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. And when the social workers tried to separate them, a sound was made, one that no human child should be able to make. 3 days later, the local sheriff who had responded to the call quit, and he never spoke about it again. The records were sealed by the state in 1973, but one of those children survived into adulthood. In 2016, she finally told her story. Everything we thought we knew about the Hollow Ridge clan was changed by what she said about her family, about what lived in their blood. Hello everyone. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. On most maps, Hollow Ridge isn't there anymore. It's a stretch of backcountry in southern Appalachia, tucked between Kentucky and Virginia, where the hills fold in on themselves like secrets. It's the kind of place where families don't leave, where names repeat across generations, where outsiders aren't welcome and questions aren't answered. For over 200 years, the ridge was home to one family. The Dalhart clan was what they called themselves, though some of the older records use different names. Dalhard, Dalhart, Dalehart. The variations don't matter. What matters is that they stayed, generation after generation. On that same plot of land, they remained, never marrying outside the ridge, never attending the churches in town, never enrolling their children in schools. They were known, but not understood, tolerated, but not trusted. By the 1960s, most people assumed the Dallarts had died out. For decades, the main house had been abandoned. The fields had gone wild. Since the end of World War II, no one had seen smoke from their chimneys or lights in their windows. The few locals who remembered them spoke carefully, as if the family name itself carried a certain weight. But in June of 1968, a pair of hunters, while tracking a wounded deer, stumbled onto the old Dalhart property. What they found wasn't a deer. It was a barn. And inside that barn were 17 children living in conditions that defied explanation. They had no running water, no electricity, no beds. On rotted hay they slept, wearing clothes stitched from burlap and animal hide. Their hair was long and matted. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, as if they'd never seen sunlight. And when the hunters approached, the children didn't run. Perfectly still they stood, staring with eyes that didn't blink, didn't waver, didn't look entirely human. The authorities were called by the hunters. By nightfall, the property was surrounded by police, social workers, and a medical team from the county hospital. What happened over the next 72 hours was documented in reports that were later buried under judicial seal, but pieces of the story survived. Fragments, whispers, testimonies that were never meant to leave the courtroom. And they all point to the same disturbing truth. The Dalhart children were not like other children, not in behavior, not in biology, and not in what they carried inside them. A woman named Margaret Dunn was the lead social worker assigned to the case. For 16 years she'd worked in child welfare, handling cases of abuse, neglect, and abandonment across 3 counties. She thought she'd seen everything. But when she arrived at the Dalhart property on the morning of June 18, 1968, she knew immediately that something was wrong. Not just with the children, but with the land itself. In her report, one of the few documents that survived the sealing, she described the air around the barn as thick, almost resistant, like walking through water. The silence was unnatural, she wrote. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees, just the children standing in a semicircle inside the barn, watching the adults with expressions she described as aware but not present. A girl who appeared to be about 4 years old was the youngest child. The oldest was a boy who looked 19, though later medical exams would suggest he might have been much older. Their names would not be given by any of them. They would not speak at all. Not for the first 48 hours. When the medical team tried to conduct examinations, the children resisted, not violently, but with a kind of coordinated stillness that made it impossible to proceed. Limp they would go, their bodies becoming so heavy that it took 3 adults to lift a single child. Cold to the touch was their skin, even in the June heat. And their eyes, every person who came into contact with them mentioned the eyes, dark, almost black, with pupils that didn't seem to react to light. For individual interviews, Margaret Dunn tried to separate the children. That's when things escalated. The moment the youngest girl was led away from the group, the others began to hum. Not a melody, but a single sustained tone that vibrated through the walls of the barn. Louder and deeper it grew, until it felt less like sound and more like pressure. The sheriff who was present described it as feeling like his skull was being squeezed from the inside. The girl who'd been separated collapsed, not fainted, collapsed, as if every bone in her body had turned to liquid. When they brought her back to the group, immediately she stood up, unharmed, and rejoined the circle. The humming stopped. No one tried to separate them again. Over the next 2 days, the authorities scrambled to figure out what to do. The children couldn't stay on the property, but no facility in the state was equipped to handle 17 children who refused to be separated and displayed behaviors that no one could explain. In an old church basement 30 miles away, a temporary shelter was set up. Together in a single bus, the children were transported. In complete silence they sat for the entire ride, hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead. When they arrived, as a unit they moved, filing into the basement and arranging themselves in the same semicircle formation they'd held in the barn. And that night, the church caretaker heard them singing, not in English, not in any language he recognized. Something older than words was how he described it. By morning, 3 of the staff members had quit. Why, they wouldn't say. They just left. The psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the children was Dr. William Ashford. He was a clinical man trained at Johns Hopkins, known for his work with trauma survivors and children from extreme isolation cases. Feral children, victims of cult abuse, and patients with selective mutism he had evaluated. With the same methodical detachment he'd used in every other case, he approached the Dalhart children. That detachment lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th day, he submitted a report to the state that included a single handwritten line at the bottom. These children are not suffering from psychological trauma. They are something else entirely. He refused to elaborate. 2 weeks later, he closed his private practice and moved to Oregon. He never treated children again. What Ashford witnessed during those 3 days was documented in session notes that were later classified. But portions of his observations were leaked in 1994 by a courthouse clerk who'd been digitizing old records. According to Ashford's notes, the children demonstrated abilities that defied conventional child development. Perfect synchronization they displayed without verbal communication, moving, turning, even breathing in exact unison. When one child was shown an image during a private session, that same image the others would later draw without having seen it. They had no concept of individual identity. When asked their names, the same phrase they would respond with, always in unison, "We are Dalhart." When asked about their parents, they would smile, not a child's smile, but something rehearsed, something hollow, and say nothing. The most disturbing observation came during a medical examination. A nurse named Patricia Hollis was drawing blood from one of the older boys when she noticed something unusual. The blood was darker than normal, almost brown, and within seconds of leaving the vein, it coagulated. More alarming was the boy's reaction. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even seem to notice the needle. But the moment his blood touched the glass vial, every other child in the building turned to face his direction. Simultaneously they stood from wherever they'd been sitting, and they began to move toward him slowly, silently, as if pulled by an invisible thread. The staff locked the doors before the children could converge. But for the next 6 hours, they stood pressed against those doors, palms flat against the wood, waiting. The boy, whose blood had been drawn, sat alone in the examination room, perfectly still, staring at the ceiling. When they finally reopened the doors, the children returned to their circle as if nothing had happened. The blood sample was sent to a lab in Richmond. It was lost in transit. No follow-up sample was ever taken. By late July, a decision had been made by the state. The children would be separated, placed in different facilities across Virginia and Kentucky. It was the only way, they reasoned, to break whatever bond held them together, to give them a chance at normal lives. Margaret Dunn opposed the decision. So did several of the medical staff, but the state moved forward anyway. On August 2, 1968, the children were loaded into separate vehicles and taken to different locations. That night, every facility reported the same thing. The children stopped eating, stopped moving. In their assigned rooms they sat, staring at the walls, humming that same low, resonant tone. 3 days later, 2 of the children were found dead in their beds. No cause of death could be determined. Their bodies showed no signs of trauma, no illness, no distress. They had simply stopped living. By the end of the week, 4 more had died. The state reversed its decision. The surviving children were brought back together, and the dying stopped. The state of Virginia didn't know what to do with children who died when separated and thrived when together. There was no precedent, no protocol, no legal framework for a situation that shouldn't have been possible. So they did what institutions always do when faced with the inexplicable. They buried it. In September of 1968, the remaining 11 Dalhart children were transferred to a private facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The place was called Riverside Manor, though there was no river nearby and it wasn't much of a manor. It was a converted sanatorium built in the 1920s for tuberculosis patients. Abandoned in the 50s and quietly reopened under state contract for cases that needed to disappear. In a single wing, the children were housed. No other patients, no visitors, a rotating staff of nurses and caretakers who were paid well and asked not to talk about their work. The official record listed the facility as a group home for mentally disabled minors. The unofficial truth was that Riverside Manor was a holding cell for a problem the state couldn't solve and didn't want exposed. For the next 7 years, the Dalhart children lived in that facility. They aged, but not normally. Medical records show that their growth was inconsistent. Some years they'd grow several inches. Other years they wouldn't grow at all. Their physical development didn't match their apparent ages. The boy who'd looked 19 when they were found still looked 19 in 1975. The youngest girl, who should have been 11 by then, still appeared to be no older than 7. Blood tests were inconclusive. Genetic testing, primitive as it was in the early 70s, showed abnormalities that the lab couldn't categorize. Their DNA contained sequences that didn't match any known human markers. One geneticist who reviewed the samples noted that certain segments resembled developmental holdovers, traits that should have been selected out of the human genome thousands of years ago. He was asked not to publish his findings. He complied. Strange occurrences were reported by the staff at Riverside Manor. Lights would fail in the children's wing, but nowhere else in the building. Temperature drops, sudden, unexplained, localized entirely to the rooms where the children slept. Objects would move, not dramatically. A cup shifted 3 inches to the left. A chair turned to face the wall. A door that had been open now closed, though no one had touched it. The children never spoke, but they communicated. Staff members described feeling watched even when the children's eyes were closed. One caretaker reported waking in the middle of the night to find all 11 children standing around her bed, silent, staring. She quit the next morning. Another reported hearing voices in the hallway, conversations in a language that sounded like English played backward. When she investigated, she found the children asleep in their beds, but the voices continued until sunrise. In 1973, the state moved to permanently seal all records related to the Dalhart case. The official reason given was to protect the privacy of minors in state custody. The real reason, according to a memo that surfaced decades later, was concern over public panic and potential legal liability should the nature of the subjects become widely known. The memo didn't elaborate on what nature meant. It didn't have to. By that point, everyone involved understood that the Dalhart children were not simply traumatized or developmentally delayed. They were something else. Something that had been living in those mountains for generations, hiding in plain sight, passing itself off as human. And now the state was responsible for it. In 1975, something changed. The children began to speak, not to the staff, not to the doctors, but to each other. Conversations in whispers, always in that same backward-sounding language that no linguist could identify. The staff tried to record it, but the audio always came out distorted, as if the sound itself resisted being captured. What they did notice was that the children had started to separate just slightly. For 7 years, they'd moved as a single unit, slept in the same room, eaten at the same time, breathed in rhythm. But now, small distinctions were emerging. One boy began spending hours staring out the window. One of the girls started drawing obsessively, compulsively, filling page after page with symbols that looked almost like letters but weren't part of any known alphabet. Another child stopped eating meat entirely and would only consume vegetables that had been grown in soil, refusing anything that came from a package or a can. It was as if they were becoming individuals, or as if whatever had been holding them together was finally loosening its grip. The staff didn't know whether this was progress or something worse. Dr. Ashford's notes had warned that separation led to death. But this wasn't forced separation, this was choice, and that raised a question no one wanted to ask. If the children were choosing to individuate, what did that mean about what they'd been before? In March of 1976, one of the older girls, estimated to be around 23, though she still looked 16, asked a nurse for her name. Not the nurse's name, her own name. It was the first time any of the children had expressed interest in individual identity. The nurse, caught off guard, looked through the intake files. There were no names. The children had been listed by number, subject 1 through subject 11. The girl stared at the nurse for a long moment, then walked away. That night, she spoke for the first time in English. She said, "We are forgetting." The nurse asked what she meant. The girl looked at her with those black unblinking eyes and said, "We are forgetting how to be Dalhart. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline." By 1978, the children had deteriorated. Not physically, but mentally. They began to display confusion, memory loss, and something the staff described as identity collapse. They would forget their own faces. One boy spent an entire day convinced he was one of the girls. Another insisted she had died years ago and that the person standing in her place was someone else. They stopped recognizing each other. The synchronization that had once defined them was gone, replaced by chaos. 2 of the children became violent, not toward the staff, but toward each other, as if they were trying to destroy something they could no longer control. They were sedated and separated into different rooms. Both of them died within 48 hours. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but their hearts had been perfectly healthy the day before. It was as if their bodies had simply given up the moment they could no longer be what they'd always been. By 1980, only 4 of the original 11 children remained alive. The state decided to close Riverside Manor. The facility was costing too much, generating too many questions, and producing no results. The surviving children were transferred to a standard group home in southwestern Virginia. They were given names. Sarah, Thomas, Rebecca, and Michael, pulled from a list of common appellations with no connection to their past. They were enrolled in a program designed to integrate developmentally delayed adults into society. It didn't work. Within 6 months, Thomas walked into the woods behind the group home and never came back. Search teams found no trace of him. Rebecca stopped speaking entirely and spent her days rocking back and forth, humming that same low tone that had haunted the staff at Riverside. She died in her sleep in 1983. Michael lasted until 1991. He lived in a supervised apartment, worked part-time at a grocery store, and by all accounts seemed almost normal until the night he walked into traffic on a highway outside Roanoke. He didn't run, didn't stumble. Witnesses said he simply stepped into the road and stood there, arms at his sides, staring at the oncoming headlights. He was killed instantly. That left Sarah, the youngest, the only one who survived. Sarah Dalhart, though that wasn't the name she was born with, if she'd ever been given a name at all, lived longer than anyone expected. By 2016, she was in her early 50s, though she looked decades younger. She'd spent most of her adult life in assisted living facilities, group homes, and halfway houses across Virginia and West Virginia. Jobs she held occasionally: dishwasher, janitor, night stock clerk, always positions where she didn't have to speak much or interact with people. By caseworkers, she was described as quiet, functional, and deeply alone. She had no friends, no romantic relationships, no connections to anyone. On the margins of society she existed, just present enough to avoid suspicion, just absent enough that no one noticed her. And for nearly 40 years, she never spoke about where she came from or who her family had been until 2016, when a journalist named Eric Holloway found her. Holloway had been researching a book on forgotten Appalachian communities when he came across a reference to the Dalhart children in a declassified court document. Most of the details had been redacted, but there was enough information to follow the trail. He tracked down former staff members from Riverside Manor, obtained partial medical records through Freedom of Information requests, and eventually located Sarah through a social services database. For 6 months, he wrote her letters before she agreed to meet him. They met in a diner in Charleston, West Virginia on a cold afternoon in November. Holloway recorded the conversation. That recording, over 3 hours long, was never released to the public, but portions of it were transcribed and published in a limited-run article that appeared in an obscure history journal in 2017. What Sarah told him that day rewrote everything anyone thought they knew about the Dalhart clan. She told him that the children found in 1968 were not the first generation. They were not even the 10th. The Dalhart bloodline had existed in Hollow Ridge for over 200 years, but it wasn't a family in the traditional sense. It was a lineage, a continuation. She explained that her ancestors, the original Dalharts, had come to the ridge in the late 1700s, fleeing something in the old country. She didn't say where, she didn't know, but they'd brought something with them. A practice, a ritual, a way of ensuring that the family would never die out, never weaken, never be diluted by the outside world. They didn't marry outsiders because they didn't need to. They didn't reproduce the way other families did. Sarah's words, according to the transcript, were, "We were not born. We were continued." Holloway asked her to clarify. She explained that the Dalhart children were not individuals. They were extensions. When a child was needed, the family would perform a ritual. She didn't describe it in detail, but she mentioned blood, soil, and something she called the speaking, and a new child would appear, not born from a mother, not in the way normal children are born. They would simply arrive, fully formed, integrated into the family consciousness. She said the children shared a single awareness, a collective mind that allowed them to function as one organism spread across multiple bodies. That's why separation killed them. It wasn't trauma or attachment. It was severance, like cutting off a limb. The body could survive, but the limb could not. And when the family consciousness began to fracture in the 1970s, when the children started to develop individual identities, it was because the lineage itself was dying. The rituals had stopped. The connection had been broken. And without it, the children were just bodies. Hollow shells trying to figure out how to be human without ever having learned. Sarah told Holloway that she was the last. The final continuation of a bloodline that had lasted centuries. She said she could still feel the others sometimes, even though they were dead. A presence in the back of her mind, voices that weren't voices. She said she spent most of her life trying to silence them, trying to be just Sarah, just one person, just human. But it never worked because she wasn't human. Not entirely. She was the last piece of something ancient, something that had hidden in the hills for generations, pretending to be a family when it was really something else. And now, with no way to continue, no way to perform the old rituals, no way to bring forth another generation, she was waiting. Waiting for the lineage to finally end. Waiting for the last thread to snap. She looked at Holloway across the table in that diner and said, "When I die, it dies with me. And maybe that's for the best." Sarah Dalhart died on January 9, 2018. She was found in her apartment in Bluefield, West Virginia, sitting upright in a chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, eyes open. The coroner estimated she'd been dead for 3 days before anyone noticed. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of illness or injury. Her heart had simply stopped. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. But the coroner noted something unusual in his report. Her body showed no signs of rigor mortis, no decomposition. Even after 3 days, her skin was still soft, still cool to the touch, as if she'd died only moments before. When they tried to move her for transport, her body was impossibly heavy, just like the children in 1968. It took 4 people to lift her into the coroner's van. By the time she reached the morgue, she weighed nothing at all. Eric Holloway attended her funeral. There were 6 people there, including the priest. No family, no friends, just caseworkers and a few curious locals who'd heard about the strange woman who never aged. She was buried in a public cemetery on the outskirts of town in an unmarked grave. Holloway stood at the edge of the plot after everyone else had left and later wrote that he felt something shift in the air the moment the first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence, suddenly absent, like a pressure releasing. He described it as the feeling of a held breath finally exhaled. He stayed until the grave was filled, then walked back to his car. He never wrote the book he'd planned. He never published the full recording of his conversation with Sarah. In 2019, he moved to the Pacific Northwest and stopped researching Appalachian history entirely. When asked why, he would only say, "Some stories aren't meant to be told. Some things are better left buried." But the story didn't end with Sarah's death. In 2020, a surveyor working in the area that used to be Hollow Ridge reported finding the remains of the old Dalhart property. The barn where the children had been found was gone, collapsed decades ago, but the main house was still standing, barely. Out of curiosity, he entered. Inside he found walls covered in the same symbols that one of the Dalhart children had drawn obsessively at Riverside Manor. Hundreds of them carved into the wood, stretching from floor to ceiling in every room. He photographed them and sent the images to a linguist at Virginia Commonwealth University. The linguist couldn't identify the language, but she noted that the symbols followed a consistent grammatical structure, suggesting they were communicative, not decorative. She also noted that many of the symbols appeared to be instructions, directions for something, a process, a ritual. The surveyor returned to the property 2 weeks later to take more photographs. The house was gone, not collapsed, not burned, just gone. The foundation was still there, but the structure itself had vanished. No debris, no signs of demolition, just an empty clearing where a house had stood for over 200 years. There have been other reports since then. Hikers in the area have described hearing humming in the woods at night. That same low, resonant tone that haunted the staff at Riverside Manor. Hunters have found circles of dead vegetation, perfectly round, in places where nothing should be able to kill the undergrowth so completely. In 2022, a family camping near the old Dalhart property reported seeing children in the trees at dawn. 17 of them, standing perfectly still, watching the campsite. The family packed up and left immediately. When they reported it to local authorities, they were told there were no children in the area, no missing persons, no camps or youth groups. The family never went back. And in 2023, a woman in Kentucky came forward claiming to be a distant relative of the Dalhart family. She said her grandmother had been born on Hollow Ridge in 1938 and had escaped as a teenager, abandoning the family and never speaking of them again. The woman said her grandmother died in 2021. But before she passed, she told her something. She said the Dalharts were not a family. They were a continuation of something older than families, something that didn't reproduce or grow, but endured. And she said that as long as the bloodline existed, it could never truly die. It would simply wait. Wait for the right conditions. Wait for the right soil. Wait for someone to remember the old ways. Sarah Dalhart was supposed to be the last, the final thread in a lineage that stretched back centuries. But lineages are not bloodlines. They are not bound by genetics or birth. They are patterns, instructions written into the world, waiting to be followed. And patterns do not die. They repeat. They resurface. They find new vessels. The state sealed the records. The witnesses stayed silent. The journalists moved on. But the land remembers. Hollow Ridge remembers. And somewhere in the soil that has drunk the blood of generations, something is still waiting. Not dead, not gone, just patient. Because that is what the Dalhart bloodline always was. Not human, not entirely, but something that learned to wear humanity like a mask, generation after generation, until the mask became indistinguishable from the face beneath. And when you bury something like that, you do not kill it. You only plant it deeper. The question is not whether it will return. The question is whether we will recognize it when it does, or whether, like the staff at Riverside Manor, like the authorities in 1968, like Eric Halloway standing at Sarah's grave, we will simply choose to look away, to forget, to pretend that some stories are better left buried, until the day we realize that the story was never buried at all. It was simply waiting for us to stop watching so it could begin.